what I was hoping to talk to you about is also in this category of things we're doing today, maybe they should be obsolete. Now, one of those that's a pretty big burden and responsibility in our trials, Jules, I'm looking at you thinking about the current way that sort of the steady state today for monitoring in clinical trials. What's your sense on its obsolescence? Should we be monitoring the way we do it all? Has its time come?
Yeah, so thanks for the question and thanks for being here. So traditionally the monitoring of clinical trials was to see how well people wrote things down on a piece of paper, asked them questions about the study, and checking what they wrote on a piece of paper against some kind of source document. In today's world, we now have risk-based monitoring, which really doesn't mean risk. It actually should be intelligent monitoring. I think risk is sort of a bad word. So what some people are doing now is they're saying, well, we're just going to go, we're going to look at 60% of the data instead of 20% of the data. So what we also found is that, and I think Transcelerate has also found that there are actually very few database changes that are going on, and we've published this. So the monitoring of clinical trials, the way it is now is actually over because the data tend to be the data. And what happens now is that we really have to spend more time on training the sites, getting them to know what they're doing, and get them to enter the data in real time. And now we're doing eSource, and we think that's, of course, right now and in the future. But if the sites can actually enter the data, and the CROs or the sponsors can actually monitor the data in real time in the office, and we did a presentation this week with Craig Wozniak at Janssen with Society of Clinical Research Sites, and everybody said, let's do direct data entry, or if you can't get it in that day, get it in within 2 or 3 days. Look at the data right away, make all the changes right away, and then when you go to the sites, and we go now maybe twice a year at most, and everything that we're talking about is what we actually do. You go there to make sure they're trained, make sure nothing's changed, do some source document review, but the data tend to be the data. And the regulators, we were actually just inspected by FDA with risk-based monitoring and eSource, they weren't worried about whether someone was born in 1982 or 1983. They really were looking at, was the protocol followed? Was the protocol monitored? Did you collect the safety data? Did you collect the primary endpoint data all properly? Not whether someone was born on October 17th or 18th. And they actually allowed for human error.
So not so much that monitoring is obsolete, but at least the task of sending somebody in the field to perhaps go data element by data element as compared to spending time talking to the investigator about quality and other issues.
And making sure they understand the protocol and the training. And what we do now, even with the investigator meeting, we find 10 or 20 things that actually matter about the study and hammer that in. And that's what we do all the time now.
Could I ask you to scoot your chair back maybe an inch? I think we've left Gigi in a shadow.
I'm so sorry. I'm sorry.
Because Gigi, I'm thinking also then about regulatory submissions, which today it's kind of just a milestone. It's like an event that just happens at the end of a development cycle. But I know you've been spending a lot of time working with folks thinking about that as a process and how to reinvent. What are your thoughts there?
So first, I just want to.
They'll do it. They said they're going to do it.
Okay, great. Hopefully you can all hear me. Just to give a little bit of context for where my perspectives are coming from. I have the great fortune at this stage of my career of running a global consortium, multi-stakeholder consortium at MIT that's called NewDigs, which is a funky acronym for New Drug Development Paradigms. And we have been focusing on looking at regulation and looking at some of the fundamental flaws of the traditional model of regulation. Thanks so much. That's better.
That's a lot better.
Great. And that is particularly under the name of adaptive licensing. We've been working for the past few years at finding ways that we might be able to move from the big bet on the single binary go, no go decision point of traditional regulatory models to one that is a much more earlier access for patients, but coupled very, very closely with more intensive monitoring. And the model also involves all of the stakeholders. The feeling is that regulators alone cannot pull this off by themselves, that this has to be a joint effort and everybody has to play a role in really driving the evolution of this paradigm. And the long and the short of it is that we were told we were crazy for taking that issue on as our first one, and because it was going to take 10 to 15 years to move the needle on pharmaceutical regulation. And basically after 3 years, the model that we have been looking at is now being evaluated in real-world pilot projects in Europe. So my comments are going to be coming from what we've seen in the course of our case-based simulations of this new regulatory paradigm called adaptive licensing here, adaptive pathways in Europe. And a couple of points around obsolescence that are just my personal observation. I think that one thing that's going to become obsolete very soon, it's already becoming obsolete in Europe, I think, is the complete disconnect between regulators and payers in the decision making and around the evidence requirements for market access. That's just not going to work anymore. We can't afford to do that. And so we're going to be seeing a lot more I think evolution of more pay-for-performance, managed entry, and managed exit models on the payer side. And I think that's a great sign of progress. It's because there's been so much dramatic positive impact from the early access pathways that have been evolving in regulation, not just adaptive licensing or adaptive pathways, but disruptive pathways in the US and others as well. So that's a very good sign of progress. I think that we're also going to be seeing a move away from, and what will become obsolete is this big bet on a single binary go, no go decision. We're already seeing that in many, many different forms. We're seeing much earlier and more frequent interactions between sponsors and regulators, and in the adaptive licensing model, other stakeholders are also involved in the upstream interactions as well. And I think we're going to be seeing staged rollouts of products where the initial approval is going to be refined over time, but informed by real-world evidence, which is fantastic. And we're going to begin to see some closing of the efficacy-effectiveness gap through a lot of this. We're also going to see new indications for those products that's coming out of some of the knowledge that's being generated from this as well. So I have a few other ones too, but I can wait on those.
No, that's really interesting. So in these early experiments in Europe, these require entirely redeveloped protocols. These are not the traditional registration studies for those particular indications, but this had to be a collaborative effort with the regulators, with the sponsors, changing the endpoints and otherwise.
Every stakeholder has to be part of the solution. Every stakeholder plays a role if this thing is going to be successful. And so it's really a major mind shift, frame shift, paradigm shift. And we have to evaluate it and go relatively slowly, but it's happening in Europe. There were 60 applications for products that sponsors wanted to put into these pilot activities, and they're unfolding in real time now. So it's very interesting. It's a wonderful opportunity to take a look at some of the critical enablers to help move this forward and help us in general move to more of a life cycle based approach with a more progressive reduction of uncertainty across the life cycle of a product for safety, efficacy, and effectiveness.
Is there a therapeutic area sweet spot that you were looking at when you were looking at
No, we actually did 13 cases, confidential cases. We had sponsors that were incredibly collaborative and stepped up to the plate with assets, and they shared proprietary data with their competitors, with regulators, payers, et cetera. And we intentionally took a very broad portfolio strategy because we really didn't know, and we didn't want to make any assumptions about where it would be more valuable or less valuable. And we didn't really find any therapeutic areas where it wouldn't, at least in principle, make sense to consider it and evaluate that approach.
Jules, what about as far as some of the new monitoring paradigms that you're looking at or implementing today? Do you see certain therapeutic areas that are sweet spots for those approaches, some that maybe are non grata that you should keep hands off?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the indication for use. I think that first of all, there has to be a change of a mindset of the clinical sites, and we've seen this a lot in oncology, in part, where there's a wait. The sites wait for the monitors to come to fix the problems. So I think there has to be a thrust of more accountability by the sites. And I think in terms of the monitoring paradigm, when you do your risk-based monitoring assessments and risk mitigation strategies, it's really going to be protocol specific. So it really depends on the risks. Some studies, you may really need to go at certain critical time points for retraining because there's something that you want to make sure they're doing it correctly. And other times you could just look at the data, and if it's measuring blood pressure and everybody knows how to make blood pressure, as long as there's no fraud and they're doing their job, you're done. So I think you have to assess it protocol by protocol.
What about geography? Are you focused in the U.S. with those efforts?
Yeah, we're primarily focused in the U.S., but we have there are studies going on. We'll have submissions going on all over the world. So I think with the EMA, it's a lot easier to have conversations with them. I think Eastern Europe, as you saw in one of the questions, and Eastern Europe is a little different. I think Australia, China is in process. I think the Japanese will be there. I think India and China may still take a little while, but I think once people appreciate the science and get rid of, as someone said, some of the bureaucracy, I think it'll all change.
Gigi, was Europe particularly interested, or were the others particularly disinterested?
I would say that Europe was particularly interested because it really met an urgent need that they had. There was a perception in Europe that they didn't have the statutory authority with the optimal degree of flexibility available, and that in the US that flexibility already existed. And I think also my hunch is that because it's largely single-payer systems and government-sponsored in Europe, that there's much more inherent sort of incentive for alignment across stakeholders in a way that really doesn't exist at the moment in the US.
So this question I'm going to ask to each of you. Let's say it works. Let's say what you're doing, Jules, with new monitoring paradigms, you're doing it now for studies, you're doing it it's incorporated in submissions. What's it going to take to become mainstream and not a niche thing that you did once or twice?
Yeah, so when I give a certain talk, I quote Seaman Knapp, who was an agriculturalist in the early 1900s working for the agriculture department, who wanted to bring in new agricultural techniques. And he went down to I think it was in Georgia, his town in Georgia, and tried to tell people, do this, do this, do this. And he gave a quote, what people will hear, they may doubt. They will doubt. What they see, they may doubt. But what they do, they'll never doubt. And could mean failure, as someone said earlier. And sometimes you fail, but it's okay. So I think the key is to do, from our point of view, we were told by a very senior person in the pharmaceutical industry, you guys do it first, you won't fail, you'll take the chance, and once you get it approved by FDA, we'll all follow. So hopefully that will happen in a couple of weeks. There'll be an approval with FDA inspections. But it really means some people take, as we heard earlier, somebody has to say, let's do it. And once you do it, someone gave Malcolm Gladwell's tipping point. There'll be a tipping point. And we offer, with any pharmaceutical company, we'll do I don't want to do a pilot, we'll do a real study. We've been doing this for 5 years already, and there's nothing to pilot. But if you want to do a study, talk to us and we'll do a study. And once you do it, and ask the sites, we've actually brought, in fact, some of the companies here have visited sites that have used eSource and direct data entry, and they said, we can see twice as many patients. We get queries within an hour of the patient leaving. So if you actually do it, and I worked at Pfizer, and I try to do some things at Pfizer, and now I would just have to say that I was on the 14th floor and the 3rd floor. My office on the 3rd floor oversaw the park, which was a parking lot. There was a sign called the park. But I can't tell you how thrilled I am. that after all these years that talking to my friend at Pfizer, and I still have some friends there, that I think it's just do it. And if you do it, and what's also interesting is that at Pfizer, the people that are there the longest are the data people, because this is all about data. Okay, this is all about data. And the data people you never want to leave because they know everything.
Remember that, data people.
Remember that.
Gigi, what about from your side? So the projects are live now in Europe. Let's look out, a couple of years as those conclude. They're successful. We've shown that you can take that adaptive approach and start to extend into different indications. Do you expect it to go mainstream? Do you think it will take incremental steps with folks? What do you see happening in that future?
So I guess a couple of thoughts on that. One is that this adaptive licensing is not a regulatory pathway in the traditional sense. It's really it's as much about process innovation as it is about policy innovation. And it will look different from one context to another. I think one thing that is going to be very, very important is that we understand how to identify the synergies across different contexts so that global sponsors don't struggle to understand how to operate in these different environments. They're so disconnected the way they play out in different contexts that it's difficult to make that happen and become one, even though it looks contextually different across jurisdictions. The other thing that's going to really have to happen with adaptive licensing is we're going to have to get a lot better with post-market monitoring. That's absolutely critical. You cannot do these early access pathways without beefing up and increasing confidence in what we can deliver post-market. So we're going to have to work really, really hard post-market. And I think we also have a really interesting opportunity now, given that globally there's this evolution towards more of a life cycle approach. Post-market monitoring is going to be important across the world, across different jurisdictions. We have a really unusual opportunity to try to, and I know this sounds crazy, but I'm an eternal optimist, to prospectively harmonize as we innovate the system of post-market monitoring and analytics, as opposed to doing it after the fact and trying to knit it together after it's already a done deal. So that's what we'd like to try to help foster in New Digs, is prospective harmonization of some of these critical enablers that can because we just think in general it's not just adaptive licensing, but we have to be much more adaptive in how we innovate. We're innovating how we innovate, and we have to harmonize as we do that globally.
Some of these are big, ambitious. They require long-term optimism, but if you don't start, you will never get there. So thank you for what you're doing, and thank you for sharing today. Please join me in thanking Jules and Gigi.
Thank you.